Alright, now before we begin, I have to add another rule to how this whole series works. As I tell these stories, you're going to notice that a lot of the same characters are going to keep popping up again and again and again. For obvious reasons. I mean, they're all true stories and these were real people. And every time I introduce a new character, I try to give a good character introduction. I try to tell you like who that person is and what kind of relationships they had with the other people and just whatever it is I think you need to know about them before I start telling this story. But I'm not going to do that in every single episode to characters that I've already done that for. So if I start talking about someone who already appeared in part 1 and had their introduction in part 1, I'm not going to reiterate their introduction. I'm just going to assume that you already know who they are and continue telling the story. That makes this series, more than any other series I've ever done, one that you really have to watch in order if you want to get all the information that you need. So just know that going in. If you're watching this video and you didn't see part 1, I'm going to start talking about characters as if you already know who they are. And that's going to be the case for every future episode that I make. Because if I keep reiterating the same information in every single video over and over and over again, that's going to get really fucking boring for people who are actually watching all of them. So go watch part 1, and if you like it, come back and watch this one. And then it could be like a little show where things happen to characters and you care about what happens to them and they evolve, and yeah, it's like a, you know, storytelling and shit, but like with real life. Alright, I think that's all the necessary introduction. Let's get started. So today's episode is going to be a little bit different than part 1. Part 1 was very much so about me. I'm really just a side character in this one. This is going to be about a friend of mine named Cruz. So there really is no delicate way of saying this, but Cruz and his twin sister were the drunken mistake of a one-night stand. His father was a trailer trash drug addict, and his mother believed that she wanted them when she was pregnant, but then once they were born, she started blaming them for taking away her youth and destroying her life and all that sort of stuff, and she just kind of treated them like shit constantly. This made both Cruz and his sister Kaya really grow to resent their mother and put their father on a super high pedestal, like way more than he deserved. Because yes, he was an extremely shitty father, but at least he liked them. That's something, you know? It also didn't help that his mother and father hated each other and constantly used their kids to get over on one another. Anyway, point is that both Cruz and his sister had a pretty fucked up upbringing because of all this. And they ended up growing up to be, fucking insane is really the only word for it. He just kind of did whatever it is he wanted to do. I've seen him chuck textbooks at teachers. He would kick things and shout and just leave class in the middle if he felt like it, and walk up to the front of the cafeteria lunch line, just get his food and leave and cut the whole fucking line. And despite the fact that this was a school filled with gangs and extremely violent people, none of them did anything about it, because none of them wanted to be that one unlucky person who he decided to make all of his childhood trauma their fucking problem. And trust me, he enjoyed doing that quite a lot. This made him develop a rather wild reputation throughout the entirety of the school and among the other gangs as someone that's just not worth messing with. Based on this description, you're probably thinking that Cruz is a bit of an asshole, and well, yeah, he was. But we kind of all were. Look, in part 1 of this series, it may have seemed like I was the good guy, but that's only because I wasn't the aggressor. Truth is that we were all a bunch of little assholes. And as these stories continue and I get older and older, you're going to start finding it harder and harder to justify a lot of the actions that I take. So I just want to prepare you for some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in the future, because this shit gets dark. That darkness gets touched on a little bit in this story, but it gets a lot worse later down the line. But that doesn't mean that the people in these stories don't have good things about them. Cruz, for example, had a very strict honor code. While if you asked him if he had an honor code, he would say no, but I knew him long enough. Yes, he did. There's essentially two types of people in this school. There's fighters and non-fighters. Cruz was an absolute and complete maniac when it came to anyone who he considered to be in that fighter category. But anyone who wasn't a fighter, people who were just regular kids going to school and not really dealing in this kind of stuff, he left alone and he treated with respect and dignity. This was a trait that differentiated Cruz from a lot of the other more violent people in the school. The vast majority of these people were just straight up bullies who preyed on literally anyone they can. Weaker people, for obvious reasons, were preyed on more. Whereas a lot of them wanted that feeling of power and authority over other people, Cruz wasn't really interested in that. What he enjoyed was the fight, the chaos, the violence and craziness of these over-the-top fights that he would have with other people. And he couldn't get that from a regular regular person who didn't know how to. And the person who was most often the target of Cruz's released chaos is someone who we are going to refer to by the name Scrap. And Scrap was a real piece of shit. So I didn't really know Scrap all that well. Like, he was in school, he was in charge of a gang, he sort of just did his own thing and I did mine, and we really didn't interact all that much. I talked to him a couple of times, but him and Cruz absolutely fucking hated each other. I mean, my God, did they fucking hate each other. Anyway, all that stuff that I just described Cruz is, Scrap is basically the exact opposite. So Scrap was known for basically extorting people in the school. Unlike Cruz, who had a very solid code of only going after people who he considered fighters, Scrap pretty much solely preyed on non-fighters. And this was pretty fucked up considering that Scrap was actually a pretty damn decent fighter himself. I mean, he was a little dude. Like, he was shorter than anybody else I knew, but he wasn't scared of nobody. I mean, he constantly would just dive face first into fights with everyone. It really didn't matter how big or how dangerous they were. This little fucker would start a fight with him. But that's not why Cruz didn't like him. You see, Scrap had this lucrative business model where he would basically plant his guys in front of different places where people needed to go and things that people needed to use, and basically create a toll or an extortion ring, whatever it is you want to call it. He would make people have to pay him so they can use the things that they would need to use. And sometimes it wasn't much of a problem. Like, when he did it to hangout areas, you would just not hang out there. But sometimes he would do it to shit like the bathrooms and the cafeteria and other places that people just really needed to get into. And oddly enough, people just kind of fell in line with it. Like, it was just understood that if you wanted to go to the bathroom between this time and this time, Scrap would have a guy out there collecting money. And he solely did this to the people that he knew wouldn't and couldn't fight back. Like, it wouldn't have been a lucrative business model if he set a guy up there to stop Titus from going in and taking a shit. Obviously, Titus wouldn't pay that shit, and you just have a fight every time you tried it. So there were certain people who were deemed acceptable and that Scrap would just let in to use the bathroom, and people he knew wouldn't fight back couldn't. And the whole damn school just bent over and allowed this shit to happen. Because, like I said, they're all assholes and nobody cares about anyone but themselves in these stories. And again, I am counting myself in that group. Now, there were a couple of exceptions. For instance, if somebody who was a fighter had a very close friend or relative, and he knew that trying to extort that person would cause problems with the fighter person, then he wouldn't do it. He'd give them a pass. But the vast majority of non-fighters did not have that. And that's just sort of the way things went for as long as I had known it at that school. I mean, when I got there, that's what they were doing, and it lasted for at least a couple of years. But it all came to an end when Scrap decided to do something pretty fucking stupid, and it basically destroyed everything he had built up to that point. In part one, I talked about the unspoken rule that boys just don't talk about any of the stuff that happens between them. You don't talk about the fights or the thievery or the extortion or any of that to any of the teachers or principals or parents or anything like that. You just, all that shit is just kept quiet. Well, another rule that no one really talked about but was just understood is that the boys' shit is very much the boys' shit. All the violence and extortion and bullying and all that kind of shit has to remain among the boys. You leave the girls out of it. They have nothing to do with this shit, and they are not to be pulled into it at any point. Well, Scrap, the piece of shit that he is, decided to break that rule. He thought it would be a more lucrative idea if he also started extorting the girls and stopping the girls from going to the bathroom and stopping the girls from going into the cafeteria. This one decision completely ruined everything that Scrap was doing and led to just insane levels of violence throughout the whole fucking school. And look, I generally don't care for any movement at all, any movement or political ideology. It's just not something I care about. But this is one reason why I can't get behind like the idea of feminism and the patriarchy being this awful thing, because these are some of the worst people I've ever met in my life. Many of them grew up to be pimps and murderers and drug dealers and pretty hardcore gang members. Their morality is essentially non-existent. But even these complete assholes lost their shit when Scrap decided to start extorting girls. There were like 12 gangs in that school, and about 9 of them just were not cool with that shit. And the one that was arguably the most upset about this was Cruz. Like I said, Cruz is not a fan of the strong preying on the weak. And while he mostly let it slide that Scrap was extorting weak boys, he could not let it slide that he started to extort girls. That just crossed a line that Cruz couldn't let go. And it probably didn't help the fact that Cruz just already didn't like Scrap and was basically his nemesis anyway. And what came next was essentially a several week long war between Cruz and Scrap, with Scrap and his gang going up against Cruz and really whoever he can get to fight with him against Scrap. And shit got fucking real. So just to explain exactly how my relationship with Cruz worked. Neither of us were in a gang. We didn't really do gangs. We both had some pretty serious issues with authority, and neither of us were really all that interested in like subjecting people to our will and power. It just wasn't something we cared to do. So we never joined any of the gangs. But we did have this sort of unspoken deal, and pretty much everyone knew it. If Cruz was dragged into some sort of situation, I would automatically assist him. If I was dragged into some shit, Cruz would automatically assist me. We came as a package deal. We did this because you can't really thrive in this school by yourself. You were always outnumbered by the different gangs that were out there. The only real way to survive was to align yourself with somebody who could fight, or preferably a group of people who could fight. So what happened is when Cruz decided to get involved in this whole conflict, I was automatically dragged into it. There was just an understanding that I would be a part of it. At this point in my life, I was pretty antisocial. Like, I didn't have a lot of friends or really anybody that I cared about. I really just didn't give a shit about anything that was happening in this whole situation. That was until Cruz told me that Lefu decided to side with Scrap in this particular engagement. Well, when I heard that, my whole fucking demeanor changed. I was like, Cruz, the fuck you didn't tell me this shit sooner? Let's go. Let's fuck this dude up now. My hatred for Lefu was at an all-time high at this point because a few weeks prior, I had finally caught up to Lefu and I was about to whoop his ass. And I chased him and he ran into a group of other people. He hid behind like 3 or 4 people who were friends of his, and I just couldn't get to him. I just barely missed my opportunity to beat this fucker's ass. And Lefu said something that really got on my nerves. He said, you know, sometimes it helps to actually have friends, Rouga. And that really bothered me. Like, that annoyed the fuck out of me. And looking back on it now, it bothered me because I knew he was right. I mean, the only real people that I cared about at that time were Cruz. I had 2 acquaintances that I hung out with Cruz that weren't really friends, but acquaintances. And I had Cruz's sister, who I had this on and off again fling with every once in a while, who I cared about quite a bit. But other than that, I didn't really have anybody. Whereas Lefu had this huge plethora of friends and allies that he could call upon at any point to cause all sorts of mayhem to my life. So a few weeks after this, when I heard about this whole engagement that was going on and that Lefu was a part of it, I had one particular goal in mind, that I didn't care how many friends this motherfucker had. I was gonna bust through every single one of them and get to Lefu and bust his fucking face underneath my foot. I wanted to prove definitively with this entire physical engagement that it did not matter how many fucking friends this asshole had, it would not protect him from me. That was my whole goal. I pretty much forgot about the whole girls' bathroom shit. I wasn't even really thinking about it. And this is where the question might come up is, why did it take me so long to beat Lefu's ass? Because Lefu's not a fighter. I've already said that before. Why didn't I just jump him or beat him at any point throughout the entire 4 years that I knew him? And that's basically due to a combination of Lefu being very careful as well as just really bad luck. So because of the school's constant fights and violence, they made a rule that only one student from one class can leave at any given time for any reason. Whether it was to go to the office or to go to the bathroom or whatever, only one person can leave. So if you wanted to get someone jumped or attack someone during class, you had to get someone from another classroom to leave class at the same time they were, and then they can jump them or do whatever it is they wanted to do. They had this very complicated note passing system that basically could set up people and get them jumped when they left to go to the bathroom. The reason why I could never touch Lefu is because I always shared a class with Lefu in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. This was because both of our last names were in the same half of the alphabet. So was Cruz. And since Cruz was really the only friend I had, I could not get anyone from the other class to jump Lefu as he left in the middle of class. He could do that to me because he had friends across both classrooms. I did not. This basically meant that the only times that I can actually get into a fight with him outside outside of the purview of teachers and police officers, because our school had police officers, was during lunch or recess. But lunch or recess, everyone was out, and Lefou was always surrounded by the plethora of fucking friends that he had. This made it very difficult for me to actually get him alone and get him into a physical confrontation, especially since the few times that I came close, he would always fucking run away and hide behind people. It was very difficult to make this fucker pay for all the shit that he pulled in those 3 years. That is why it took all the way up to 6th grade for me to actually deal with this motherfucker. Don't worry, we'll get to that story eventually. So back to the story, basically what we ended up having was a several week long engagement where boys from two different sides, Cruz's side and Scrap's side, they were essentially fighting over whether or not the girls would have the rights to use the bathroom and eat in the cafeteria without getting extorted. And people from all sorts of different gangs who agreed or disagreed with this left those gangs to join one side or the other, and this devolved into, oh man, countless fucking fights that happened in school, out of school on the weekends, anytime someone went to the bathroom, anytime it was lunchtime or recess, or fucking just constant throughout the whole neighborhood. There was just engagement after engagement, fight after fight over this particular thing. So on Cruz's side, you had people like me, Titus, this guy named Sobo, who's not really too big of a deal in this story, but is eventually going to become a very big deal in future stories. And then on the other side, on Scrap's team, you got people like fucking Lefou, Nash, and 3 new people being introduced who we're gonna call Balam, Yonnis, and Ogre. And if you're thinking, you know, Rouga, these names are really fucking stupid. Why don't you just choose normal goddamn names? Well, my answer to that would be, if I use normal names closer to the names that these people had in real life, you get a lot of shit like Hannah and Philip and Paul. And I'm sorry, that's just fucking lame. I want to give people more interesting names. Sue me. Now, there were far more people than this on both sides, but I'm not going into every single one of them because a lot of them aren't really that important, and a lot of the engagements that happened between people I wasn't even there for. So I'm only really focusing on the characters that I had the most interaction with, not only in this story, but future stories as well. Anyway, for the next couple of weeks, shit just went down. Double got into a fight with Ogre and beat his ass, and then Yondas beat the shit out of Gary. I didn't say this before, but Gary was also on our side, and he got his ass beat by Yondas. And then Scrap and Titus got into it multiple times during those couple of weeks. At one point, Cruz was jumped by Balam and Yondas at the same time. But don't worry, he got away with just a couple of bruises. He was able to fight them off. But I mean, this shit was non-stop. It was just constant. There were just so many fights back and forth with people getting their ass kicked multiple times over the course of several weeks. It was brutal. And this continued for some time until it got pretty goddamn serious. So I didn't really talk about this earlier, but basically I had a friend group of 4 people. It was me, Cruz, and the other 2 people we're going to call Andy and Tyler. Let's just call them that. They're not fighters. They're not a part of a gang. They were just like regular people. The only person who's going to be important to this story is Andy. So Andy was very much so like a regular kid. He was short. He was skinny. He had thick fucking Harry Potter glasses. All he wanted to do in his whole life is play Yu-Gi-Oh! And jack off. He was very much so just a normal 5th grade boy. He wasn't involved with all this shit. But he was a part of my and Cruz's friend group. So normally he was left alone by most of the other gangs because they knew they fucked with him, they fucked with me and Cruz, so, you know, they just let him be. And because of his relationship with me and Cruz, he got a pass when it came to Scrap's extortion ring. But a couple of weeks after this little war started, Scrap decided to go farther than he ever had before. And this is where the engagement got a lot more intense than otherwise would be. Basically, Scrap got a couple of his guys together and they jumped Andy and beat the ever-loving shit out of him. One day in the middle of school, we went to classes, and although Andy was there and we all knew he was, he just didn't show up for class. So the teacher had a couple of kids leave class and go look for him, and they found him laying face down on the side of the fucking school, just in a field, just passed the fuck out. Glasses broken, the side of his face all swollen. It was pretty nasty, man. Now, up to this point, everybody was still following the general rules of engagement. Andy had absolutely nothing to do with this war. Scrap decided to go after him solely due to the fact that he was friends with me and Cruz. He did this just to piss us off. There was no other reason. Andy was not a threat to him. This action elevated the entire war to a totally new level of fucked up. Because now that Scrap has broken the rules of engagement, Cruz and I no longer felt that we were beholden to those rules of engagement. And we fucking went off. Now, Cruz and I's response to this was admittedly a bit extreme. Scrap's best friend in the whole world was Yonnis. Now, I wish there was more that I could say about Yonnis, like really give
give him a good description, but every interaction I had with the man was basically the exact same. He's just a bully. He was a big old fucking Cuban who was larger than most other people and liked to inflict his power and control on other people, weaker people. He was essentially the right-hand man of Scrap, and he would very often be the guy who was outside of certain places extorting people in order for them to use it. And if Scrap wanted somebody jumped and didn't do it himself, you could pretty much guarantee he left that up to Yonnis. The only ways I could really describe him is by saying that he was a bully and just an all-around dick. So what me and Cruz decided to do next was actually a pretty big event in my life, because it was the first and only time in my life that I ever jumped someone, like ambushed another person with multiple people for the sole purpose of hurting them very badly. I never did this after this, and up to this point in my life, it was also the most I had ever hurt another human being. Yonnis was one of these guys who walked home just like a lot of the rest of us, and me and Cruz after school one day followed him. We cornered him and we beat the living shit out of him. And this wasn't just a couple bruises or a bloody nose. I mean, we really hurt this guy. When we were done with him, he had lost several of his front teeth, needed a ton of stitches inside of his mouth, and developed, as far as we were aware, a permanent lisp from that point on. The man couldn't talk right for as long as we knew him afterwards, which admittedly wasn't that long, because his mom was so terrified after that she pulled him from the school. As far as I'm aware, I think he started getting homeschooled after that. And this was a massive blow to Scrap, because while Yonnis wasn't his best fighter he was his most loyal and the one that he relied on the most. While people like Nash and Ogre were easily better fighters than him, they didn't have that kind of loyalty to Scrap. Nash was only there because Scrap paid him, and Ogre wasn't even friends with Scrap and dropped out of the conflict after his ass was beat by Sobo. As the conflict continued, it just became more and more obvious that Scrap was fighting a losing battle. The vast majority of the gangs were against him, and the people who were fighting on his side were just dropping out like fucking flies because they just couldn't deal with the sheer number of people who were giving them shit. There were two guys on Scrap's team that are so loyal to him that they would have stuck by him no matter what. One being Yonnis and the other one being Balam. And with Yonnis gone, this was a massive hit against Scrap. He really only had one dude left. The interest in fighting for his goals among all of the people who were not loyal to him just wasn't there anymore. So the conflict finally ended maybe 3 or 4 days after Yonnis was jumped, when Cruz decided to take on Scrap in a 1v1 and I decided to take on Balam. Now Balam was one of these guys who just had a fucking mouth on him. He was an absolute dick and just spoke disrespectfully to pretty much everyone around him. Just to give you an example, I remember my first week at school, I had taken a test and I got an A on it. It was the first test that I took while I was at this school. And they handed the test back to me. I was looking at the test and had a big smile on my face because I got an A. Balam, who at the time was sitting 2 chairs away from me, looked at me and said, "Why the fuck you smiling? You so stupid that you can't get a fucking A?" Look, I get it. I was a little shit too. I had a mouth on me. But he just went out of his way to insult some guy he didn't know anything about. I had never spoken to this motherfucker before. So to be honest, yeah, I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this guy. He had a really bad first impression. Now, by the time we actually got into a fight, I had known him for like 2 years by this point, and I just don't recall him ever saying anything not shitty to me, or really anyone that wasn't Scrap or Yonnis. And I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty fucking excited to shut him up. So my fight with Balam happened on the side of the school in the exact same spot where Andy was jumped. And I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit curious going into this because I had never seen Balam fight before. Balam was always this big fucking Mexican that just stood there and looked scary, but I never saw him throw a punch. So I had no idea if he could even fight or not. But just to give you a bit of a timeline here, this event happened in 5th grade, 1 year after my fight with Nash and the whole race war situation that happened in part 1. So by this point, I had experience fighting big dudes who actually knew how to fight. So while I was curious, I wasn't really scared going into fight him. Having said that, I didn't really need any of that experience. This was a very one-sided fight. So let me explain something to you guys who've never punched someone in the face before. If you've punched enough people in the face, you can tell the difference between someone who's been punched a lot in the face and someone who hasn't. Generally speaking, someone who's been punched in the face consistently over the course of several years will have a certain resistance when you hit them. Their neck feels stronger as it doesn't give out quite as easy. The bones in their face feel harder. The punch against whatever it is you're hitting just feels far more solid than if you were to punch someone who's just never been hit before. And the moment I hit Balam in the face, I instantly knew this man has never been punched in the face before. Punching this man was like hitting fucking Play-Doh. My fist went through his face like a freight train through tinfoil. There was was zero resistance at all. It felt like I broke his fucking neck. No joke, this fight gave me fucking blue balls. I came in here really excited for a big fight to take on one of the guys I know for a fact jumped Andy, and this motherfucker was out in one fucking punch. Face swollen and purple and blood pouring out the side of his eye. He just didn't get up. It was a single fucking punch. That shit was anticlimactic as fuck. By this point, this little war thing that was going on had been going on for weeks. I've had like 3 fights before this that were all far closer and better fights than this guy who was like one of the right-hand men of Scrap. Very underwhelming, very disappointing. But he was dealt with, which meant only Scrap was left. And I didn't deal with Scrap. About a day or 2 later, Cruz and Scrap had their final fight. The fight lasted, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. Actually a pretty long time for a fist fight. And I wasn't kidding when I said Scrap could fight. He was a little dude, but he used everything he possibly could at his disposal. I mean, he scratched, he bit, he kicked. He was scrappy. Scrap was scrappy. By the end of it, both boys were bloodied and bruised, but the winner was clear. Cruz won. Cruz just stood there covered in bruises and blood, looking down at Scrap, who was struggling to breathe. And the conflict really just had no choice but to end. Scrap didn't have any more people on his side. Everyone in his gang left him and joined other gangs, with the exception of Balam, who was outed as a fucking pussy. From that point on, everybody lost respect for Scrap. Nobody respected his rules or his little extortion ring. By that point, if he would have stood outside the cafeteria bathrooms and tried to extort someone, they'd just go tell one of the other gangs. The whole gang would show up and just whoop his ass. Nobody was tolerating that shit anymore. He just overreached a little too far. And from that point on, he essentially became a pariah in the school. He was disrespected by everybody. Nobody would join his side no matter what. He was just some loser who failed. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, Cruz overcame his nemesis. He beat him about as bad as you can. Scrap lost everything. If only my eventual defeat of Lefu could have been quite so unanimous. But anyway, that's it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, do all that cool shit. Sorry this video took a little bit longer than you guys are used to. Like I said, I am working extremely long hours. I'll try to make the next one maybe a little bit shorter so that I can get something out to you guys in a reasonable time. But thank you for making it this far, and y'all be safe out there, you hear?